It's no secret that League is in a pretty shitty state. From the rampant toxicity and negative behavior to how a single death in lane often means little to no chance of coming back. And while there are many smaller factors that add up and contribute to this fact, a few I've already even talked about, I believe this topic today is probably the single biggest factor as to why League is in such a horrible state, where fixing it could almost single-handedly get us back to the days when everyone considered League to be at its prime, which is Counterplay. Counterplay is something I've mentioned here and there in some of my other videos, notably in the video on stat checks, but I don't think I did a good enough job at explaining just how important it is for a game like League, and just how much of the game it actually affects. The biggest of these that Counterplay is the primary driving factor in is the Counterpick meta and Metaslave mentality, the significant degradation of the ranked system's integrity, the current state of canister champion designs, snowballing and why the game feels so hard to carry, why the game isn't very interesting to watch, and even why the community is so toxic. The first being the Counterpick meta and Metaslave mentality is pretty much how a lot of the time a lane is decided not by who is necessarily better, but rather who got the second pick in champ select. The reason this is the case is because some champions are going to be better suited than others, essentially starting the game with a league, and due to how impactful leads are in League, because of factors like power being almost entirely passive effects, and the generally low skill nature of the game, it means that since the opponent doesn't really have any way to outplay them, that lead is just going to be able to be compounded further and further as the game goes on, which is most true at the very beginning when a lead is most impactful. The best example of this are ranged tops, and how being able to second pick a ranged top against a melee like Darius is essentially just a free win that can only be stopped either through the ranged top being significantly worse, or outside intervention like junglers and roamers. And this also feeds into the Metaslave mentality, where because so much of an emphasis is placed on which champion you pick, rather than the individual skill, it means that picking a champion that you can more consistently get leads with is going to give you a better chance at winning, and of course in a competitive PvP game like League, you're going to want to have the best chances at winning. It essentially raises the question of why you would ever want to intentionally put yourself at a disadvantage when you can just play X champion of the month, which creates a very unhealthy scenario where people are more willing to sacrifice fun and enjoyment for wins, which then means that if you do lose, it feels like all that much more of a time waster and can get people tilted even faster. And this also leads us well into the next point, which is the degradation of the ranked system's integrity. What I mean by this is that Counterplay is one of the largest sources of skill in League of Legends. It not only provides skill expression to the user, needing to understand your own weaknesses and how to play around them, but also the enemy's weaknesses and how you can abuse them. This means that there are more opportunities to express your skill and get a lead through being better, and because of this, it means that worse players are being punished more frequently and consistently. For example, the Yuumi suggestion I gave back in the video I did on her, where I gave the example of her needing to hop on and off for more of her power, which then gives the enemy the opportunity to catch her. It means that a silver player can't just play Yuumi and get to diamond because of how much more skill the individual needs. Next, with the current state of champion designs, I think this one's a point that most people can probably assume, but is actually a bit deeper than you probably imagined. Zoe is Cancer because her E is a 2.25 second stun that quite literally prevents the opponent from being able to dodge her main nuke. Yuumi is Cancer because she provides all of her effects from untargeted ability and invulnerability. Samira is Cancer because her W is an instant cast projectile deleter. Most modern champions are pretty unanimously hated, and most OG players will reminisce about older champions and how much more fun they were, but what's interesting is that a big part of what makes modern champions Cancer was also commonly seen in older champions as well. Pantheon in his Q spam, Malzahar in his notoriously Cancer ult, Yorick in his ranged poke spam. There's so many examples I can give of champions being very frustrating and constantly hated on by the community, and almost every single one, if not literally every single one, can be attributed to a lack of counterplay. Pantheon's Q was a point-and-click nuke that was also highly spammable, which then paired well with his E-execute passive and the point-and-click W that gave him a ton of kill pressure onto low HP enemies. Malzahar was one of the most hated champions in all of League, up there with the devil himself, and almost all of the hate stemmed back to just his ult, because there was a point-and-click ability that not only stunned you for a full 2.5 seconds, but it was also a suppression that, for whatever reason, was unaffected by tenacity. And I could go on and on about older champions, from Tryndamere and his slot machine gameplay, to Blitzcrank and how getting hit by a single ability was death. So then why do we think of old champion designs as better? Well, while the topic is quite extensive, and I would love to do an entire video dedicated to old and new champion designs, there were a few aspects of the game that made it play quite differently, like mana being more of a consideration, or how damage was far lower and gave much more time to react. But what is probably the biggest is that at least a few of the old designers actually cared about Counterplay. And while I would say that they did a pretty shoddy job with it, you can see in many cases that they at least tried, and it could have just come down to their lack of experience. For example, Pantheon and Yorick with their mana issues that dissuaded them from just spam poking, or keeping class designs fairly balanced like I went over in another video. While they weren't perfect and did receive hate for it even back then, it wasn't nearly as severe as it is today, where they call it a high gameplay moment and do the exact opposite, trying to emphasize that aspect of their kit and nerf as much useless crap on the kit as they can to make it to a 50% win rate. The game feeling uncarryable is a factor that I doubt most people considered, where because you can't really lower the power level of an enemy due to the lack of counterplay, it means a lot more emphasis is put on how many enemies there are in a fight rather than how well each person plays. This is a big reason why ganking and roaming is such an overly dominant strategy, as well as why games can feel so uncarryable, because much more emphasis is put on the weakest links rather than the best players. And while you obviously don't want one player to be able to win the game from a sideline all by themselves, because leagues should have that balance of team play, where it is now and the way it's been handled is an extremely poor way to do it. Something like turrets providing only global gold rather than primarily local gold so it spreads out the power is a bit better. And then snowballing being an overly dominant force is again due to that nature of power issue I mentioned already, where because power in League is primarily passive effects like items, runes, and champion levels, it puts almost all of the emphasis on kits and their abilities. And because of the identity of the game being fairly low skill with an emphasis on things like farming and understanding lane matchups, it means a player with a league can really only be stopped through macro, which was heavily degraded over the years through the removal of things like mana and counterplay, leading to what we saw for the longest time and even a bit today, where snowballing was an overly dominant force and games were being decided before the first tower was even taken. Next is the viewability or viewer experience of League. To explain my point, I want you to watch one of my favorite clips of all time. That clip was of course the infamous Daigo full parry, easily being one of the most hyped moments in gaming history, and it was only possible because Chun-Li's ability gave the opportunity for the enemy to outplay it. If Street Fighter was made by Riot today, the attack wouldn't be parryable and would be seen as Chun-Li's high gameplay moment, making that moment just another player using their skill to get a lead and then using the finisher to end it in a flashy way. But because that counterplay option of parrying each attack was there, even if it was extremely unlikely, it allowed that moment in history to happen and made watching infinitely more interesting because it essentially gave Daigo the opportunity to show just how good he truly is. And this is something that League desperately needs because of how boring the game and pro scene is to watch nowadays. It used to be that the game wasn't very interesting to watch because games could go on for too long and there wasn't enough flashiness to the combat. But now it's because the game was pushed far too heavily into that fiesta action-packed high-tempo gameplay that ended up taking away the most interesting skill expression points of League in favor of high gameplay moments and one-shots. And then lastly, before I end this off, we have Counterplay feeding into the toxicity of the community. This is probably another pretty self-explanatory one. Things that take away our control or don't give us the opportunity to play around it are very frustrating. From the Blue Shell in Mario to the Grav Dragon meta in Overwatch, it doesn't even have to be a competitive game where something is on the line and tensions are high. For example, Divinity 1 and the fights that have way too much CC in them, constantly chaining it so that you literally just can't play the fight. Something inside of us just hates not being able to do anything about these types of scenarios, and not having counterplay is a massive source of this. And that's pretty much it. Let me know what you guys think of counterplay in League and if I missed anything. Subscribe if you aren't, leave a like if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.